to go? All right, good morning. Welcome to I guess this is supposed to be the fourth, but it's actually the third edition of our Lenten series on the law. We're delighted to be back this week and to have a special guest with us, whom I'm delighted to introduce. Dr. Brent Stawn is both professor of Old Testament and professor of law at that other university down the road, whose basketball team, I think, just made the Final Four. But we won't linger on that. Dr. Stawn is the author of many books on the Old Testament, including 2 in just the last year. So he's had a pretty productive pandemic. One book called Lies My Preacher Told Me, an honest look at the Old Testament. And to be clear, those are lies that his preacher told him.
That's right, that's right.
No such falsehoods uttered from the pulpit here. And the other is, remind me of the title. It's,
Honest to God Preaching.
Honest to God Preaching, talking sin, suffering, and violence. Yeah. So you know all those easy topics about the Old Testament. But this morning, Dr. Stawn is going to present on one of his many areas of expertise, Old Testament law, and specifically the Ten Commandments. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Stawn. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for coming to all you here and those probably millions that are live streaming. There's probably, it's crazy on the internet right now. I know it's wild, but that happens when I find frequently Old Testament professors frequently followed by paparazzi and other sorts of things. I'm surprised there's not some out there in the bushes even now hanging on the next words that are coming about the Old Testament. So it's really great to be here. I'm thankful for the opportunity. I haven't been in this particular church, so it's beautiful and nice to be here. It's only my 3rd year at Duke. I taught for 18 years before that at Emory University in Atlanta, which is a fine school but has no basketball program. So, and it's actually in the bylaws of Emory University that they will never, ever, ever, never, ever, ever have a football program. So it was written into the bylaws. So it's great to be here. And I listened to Philip's first session, and he sent it to me, and I thought it was fantastic. And if you all saw it and heard it, then this is really just a bit of a repetition or refrain. But I am going to focus on the Ten Commandments at his request. And I found it to be the case in my own teaching that I can remember about 4 things. So it's a pedagogical thing in my class. The students make fun of me, but there's 4 things on everything. There's 4 things on reading the Bible, and 4 things on reading biblical narrative, and 4 things on reading biblical poetry. And that's about it. I have found 5 is too many, and I found 3 is not enough, with all due respect to the Godhead. That's my one Trinity joke, and those are as good as the jokes get. So I remember about 4 things, and so what I wanted to do with the time we have, which I know is fairly limited, is to talk about 4 things about the Old Testament. 4 things on the Decalogue, I should say, the 10 Commandments. Well, they're in the Old Testament, I do know that. But 4 things on the Decalogue, and they aren't exceedingly long, I don't think, nor exceedingly complicated, and I think they will have been touched on in many important ways by Philip's opening session. But then we can have some questions about that, or comments about that, or other things that might come along as we go, or that you may have been thinking about last night in the middle of the night, wondering about at 2 in the morning about the Decalogue. I will do my best to take them up. So, the first of my 4 is that the 10 Commandments are important. I like to keep it kind of simple, right? The 10 Commandments are important. I don't really have a PowerPoint except for this part, that the 10 Commandments are important. And they're important for a number of ways, but we could just begin with their popularity as a sort of a contemporary icon. So there is the statue monument of the 10 Commandments that was installed in Alabama and then led to a court case, at least a Supreme Court case within the state of Alabama, whether it should be removed or not. That's a remarkable kind of piece. And one way we could think about this is to know the 10 Commandments, because they're iconic, is that, we have 10 commandments of this, that, or the other thing. We have the real 10 commandments. We have 10 commandments of business success or whatever, right? But this particular motif of knowing the Ten Commandments or posting them has been a popular thing, especially in the South of the United States. And I lived in Georgia for 18 years, and one of my state representatives, U.S. representatives, Lynn, what was his last name? Not Westmoreland. I think it was Lynn Westmoreland. I forget what district he was. He appeared on the Colbert Show to talk about his legislation that he had introduced to Congress about requiring posting of the commandments. So note to self, don't go on the Colbert Show first and foremost. I mean, you're gonna get outfoxed. And so then Colbert says, you've introduced this legislation. He says, why, yes, I have, about posting the Ten Commandments in public courthouses. Why, yes, I have. What are the Ten Commandments? Colbert says. And then he lifts his hands to count them off. And the good congressman could only list 3. So first note to self, don't go on the Colbert Show. Second note to self, don't go on the Colbert Show unless you actually know the Ten Commandments. Or at least don't introduce legislation to post the Ten Commandments if you don't know the Ten Commandments. So there's more to be said about that, but at least one thing is that the Ten Commandments have a kind of iconic status, right? So this is one instance of this, but there are others that we already heard a little bit in Philip's first session, namely the Ten Commandments movie here with Charlton Heston, right? There's a picture. You'll notice that my copy is actually signed. I got it off the internet, but there it is. You can get signed copies on the internet. Then, of course, here's some examples. We've got Rembrandt on the right and Michelangelo's Moses on the left. You might notice famously he's portrayed with horns in the statue because of the passage in Exodus where it says he came down and his face shone. In Hebrew, that word seems to be related to a word for horn, and in the Latin, the Vulgate, actually translates it as Moses was horned. And so Michelangelo picks up on that and actually portrays Moses with horns. Here's some other ones. This is in Tennessee. I forget where exactly in Tennessee. This is a Ten Commandments monument that's so large you can see it from space. It's a satellite image. So to give you some sense of scale, you can drive your car up here in the middle. That's how big it is. And the stones that record the commandments are so heavy, they're sort of sinking into the earth and being covered over with grass now. But we could keep going, right? Here's another one. Some presentations you don't want messed with. That's from Adobe, and you can see Moses originally had 15, evidently, and something went wrong. So don't mess with them. This gives you a sense of the 10. And in fact, to go in the same vein for just one more moment with this PowerPoint before I leave it, that 15 commandments business leads to a question of how many commandments there really are in the 10. We have the 10 commandments as the title, or in Hebrew it's really the 10 words. So the words are thought of as another word for commandment or a term for the commandment. But the 10 words is what the Hebrew text actually calls them. It doesn't call them the 10 commandments, just the 10 words. And that's appears in these texts, that language. But maybe there's more than 10. If you actually start counting, how many injunctions there are in the 10 commandments, you could get more than 10. On the other hand, you could get less than 10. More than 10 would be like, don't covet your neighbor's ox, don't covet your neighbor's donkey. Those could be more than one, right? Those could be 2. So you could get more than 10, 15, 16, so something like that. But you could also get less than 10 in the way that commandments relate to each other and seem to sort of collapse into each other in some ways. What is the difference between taking up the Lord's name, for instance, and bearing false witness? These are some of the questions where people have talked about sort of repetitions or internal echoes within the 10 that maybe reduce the number from 10 to less than 10. And this has also been a stream in the history of interpretation where ultimately it's the first commandment that matters most of all. 10, therefore, could be a mnemonic device, easy enough to number off on your hands, unless you're a representative for the Congress from Georgia. And then you really only need 3. And then for you mathematicians out there, maybe 10 is a mistake for binary code. You know, maybe it was just 1 and 0. So really just 2, a 1 and a 0. And what would those 2 be? That would be an interesting question. But here's my final point about numbering the commandments. There are different systems of numbering the commandments. You probably know this, but if not, here's a little chart that gives you no less than 7 different attested numbering. So in the Jewish tradition, Augustine, Lutheran and Roman Catholic, Reformed, Christian, Orthodox Christian, Josephus, and Philo. These are differently attested systems that give you a sense of how they number them slightly differently. Now this is an important thing to know, not because you need to memorize them. Most Protestant traditions are in here. But what's important about it is that if anybody ever asks you about the 10 Commandments, say like you appear on the Colbert Show, and he asks you what are the 10 Commandments, the first thing to say is, which numbering system? Okay. But what this does is it buys you crucial time. Okay, it buys you crucial time to remember as many of the 10 Commandments as you can. And also it says to Colbert, I know what I'm talking about, back off. And so he might just change the subject altogether. In other words, it's a useful delaying tactic if you know anybody who knows, who might be just a little too interested in the 10 Commandments. So the Decalogue is important for a number of reasons, and I'm still on my first point. They're important. They're important because there's also more than one. Philip talked about this. There's more than one version of the 10 Commandments. It appears in 2 places, Exodus 20 and then also Deuteronomy 5. And what's important about this is not only are there two versions, but also with differences. I'm going to come back to that. But again, to underscore this first point, the Decalogue is important, and we should say the importance of the Decalogue, and in scare quotes here because there's actually these 2 versions. The importance is underscored in this way, that in both cases, in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the 10 Commandments are separated out as the law, as its own kind of type of law, separate law, and they're also in pole position, placed first in their respective corpora of law. Not only that, it is said that the 10 Commandments are the only unmediated law that Israel gets. All other law is given through Moses, through the mediation of Moses. And then finally, the Decalogue is repeated twice and then also unfolded in other instances, what we might call Decalogue 3 and following. So, these are the ways that the Bible itself underscores the importance of the Decalogue. You repeat something if it's important, right? You repeat something if it's important, right? And in the biblical world, they didn't have italic or underlining or big fonts or things like that. If you wanted to stress something, you repeated it. And so repetition is a sort of biblical form of underlining. And so that's one way that the text underscores its importance, but also that these Decalogue is separated out and put in pole position before all the other corpora, legal corpora, suggests that the 10 Commandments are the head of all the law, the supreme articulation of it, as it were. And then the literary context, which says that it's these words that Israel heard and none other. And that was plenty. That was plenty. They were like, that's enough, really. Moses, can you hear the rest? Because we're not sure we can handle anymore. And then the repetition and the unfolding suggests all this sort of business. So that's my first point, and I will end this PowerPoint now. If I just close that, maybe it might. No, it won't. I don't need any more of the PowerPoint. See, there we go. So that's my first point. The 10 are important. The second is that the 10 are comprehensive. The 10, I think, in some ways intend to be or try to be a comprehensive articulation of the central core legal principles of ancient Israel. They do so in a couple ways. One is they're presentation in the particular literary form that they have. This is what biblical scholars like to call apodictic law. That's absolute law, as opposed to conditional or case law. So you will not or shall not or must not murder is an absolute legal prescription versus you cannot kill unless, in fact, it's sanctioned by the state in the cases of capital punishment. That'd be a case law, where there's exceptions, there's rounding out the case in some way. So the fact that the Ten Commandments are this apodictic law is one way that the Ten Commandments are seen as comprehensively authoritative. The commandments include both positive and negative law. Don't do this, but also do this, right? Two positive injunctions in particular: honor your parents and keep the Sabbath. The other way that they are comprehensive that we might lift up is how they move in content from the Lord, your God, in Commandment 1, to the neighbor at the end. So this kind of comprehends the vertical, as it were, relationship of the human being with God, and also the horizontal relationship of the human being with others in the human community. So to quote Patrick Miller, whom Philip quoted in the first session, the commandments are about ultimately the good neighborhood, or maybe the God neighborhood. I put that little second O in parentheses to be kind of cool or something. The good neighborhood, the God neighborhood, the movement from God to neighbor comprehends, as it were, the universal and specific realms, the divine realm and the realm of the human. There's an example of this I'll quote from Luther. I hope that's okay to quote Luther in an Episcopal church. I'm not Episcopalian myself, but I did want you to know that I brought my Book of Common Prayer with the NRSV. And not only that, I'm not Episcopalian, but I do play one every morning when I read the daily office. I even have a daily office book. That's next level, right? Extra credit kind of stuff.
Well, I was going to say, true Episcopalians have the BCP and hymnal.
I know, and a hymnal. I know you're not into the Bible. It's amazing when people, I know. When Episcopalians read the Bible, they're like, wow, there's so much Book of Common Prayer in here. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's the kind of the joke, isn't it? So, in any event, let me quote Luther here about the importance of the comprehensive nature of the Ten Commandments. This is in his large catechism. This much is certain. This is a stunning assertion from Luther. Anyone who knows the Ten Commandments perfectly knows the entire Scriptures. Think about that for a second. That's great, that's good. So if you don't want to memorize all of the Bible, just memorize the 10 and try to know them perfectly. Luther says you're good. In all affairs and circumstances, that person can counsel, help, comfort, judge, and make decisions in both spiritual and temporal matters. That person is qualified to sit in judgment upon all doctrines, estates, persons, laws, and everything else in the world. That's what Luther says. If you know the Ten Commandments perfectly. That's a remarkable statement, right? And it underscores the comprehensive nature of the Decalogue. I think the final thing I want to say about this before we go on is that the comprehensive nature of the Decalogue is something one might assert, as I have, but we could also pause and be curious about that. Why this particular set of texts in this particular set of injunctions set and placed where they are, functioning as they seem to do, because it's not, on the face of it, a comprehensive list. Much is left unsaid. I'll come back to this in a minute. But when you say you shall not kill, or you will not kill, or something like that, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you can't kill animals to eat? Does that mean you should never prosecute a war? Does that mean that all instances of criminal punishment will never include capital punishment? Well, we know, in fact, that none of those things obtained in ancient Israel society. They did have capital punishment cases. They did occasionally prosecute war and had laws about war. And, of course, they also killed animals, both for food and for worship in the sacrificial system. So what does it mean to say, right? The you shall not kill? And then, well, more needs to be said, right? More needs to be said. So the curious nature of the commandments is related in part to their brevity, the spareness with which they they are articulated, which invites further conversation and interpretation, and even requires it, as we'll see momentarily. What that is also suggested is that to some people, and I think they're sort of on the right track, is that maybe the Ten Commandments aren't law as properly understood. Maybe they really aren't legal prescriptions as such, but something slightly different, something more important maybe. Maybe they are a kind of wisdom material, a kind of a suggestion and articulation of how one lives rightly, and therefore not a comprehensive system in the sense that every jot and tittle, every possible infraction of the speed limit in Chapel Hill is articulated in the legal code, but rather these sorts of large guidelines that sort of mark life. It's a kind of invitation to the wise, righteous life. And that, according to some scholars, isn't true solely for the Ten Commandments, but true of much of ancient Near Eastern legal jurisprudence, including the Old Testament. That what we have in this is not actually a full law code, like the North Carolina Law Code or something like that, but instead a kind of I'm searching for the right word exactly. Kind of template, maybe, of possible cases, some of which might be never really have occurred, but are sort of thought experiments on the part of the ancient Near Eastern legal jurists, and then a kind of a playing field by which one finds one's way and ultimately lives wisely in ancient Israel. This is perhaps signaled most importantly by the last commandment. So you have this handout here, the Ten Commandments compared, Exodus on the left and Deuteronomy on the right in the New Revised Standard Version. The last commandment, the 10th, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. That's the Exodus version. Deuteronomy slightly differently. This is a very curious law, right? On the face of it, coveting it seems to be an interior affect state. How do you mandate that? This is how do you prescribe law for interior affect states? You shall not feel this way. The police are going to pull you over. Yeah, we caught you feeling a certain way when you were driving down Franklin Street, right? Well, how did you know? How do you know what I was feeling? How do you know, right? I protest, give me my phone call. So, this is how do you to legislate an interior affect state? This is a curious phenomenon, which has led some scholars to say, well, this must not be that. It must be something else. It must not be an interior affect state. It must be an actual activity of some sort. And there's appeal made to the prophet Micah, where there's a line that says the people who are wicked covet at night, and in the morning they seize their neighbor's goods. Okay, that's a poetic line, and there's the poetic parallelism. It doesn't necessarily mean that the verb to covet requires one to think of seizure of property. But that's what some people think, and you can see why they think that. How could you prescribe an interior affect state? Well, I think that's exactly the point. I think the commandments are mandating an interior affect state in the 10th commandment. If not clearly in Exodus 20, then surely in Deuteronomy 5. Look at Deuteronomy 5. Neither shall you covet your neighbor's wife, neither shall you desire your neighbor's house or field. So you have two verbs now, not just one. And the second one in Hebrew there, desire, is definitely related to interior affect states. So what that suggests is this is a curious kind of law, right? It's like saying love this, or really like this. I mean, how do you punish for that? How do you ensure that it's followed? Well, it suggests that the law here is a different kind of law, isn't it? It starts going into the interior nature of the person who receives the law and signs on to this kind of covenant with this kind of God. In fact, when you get to the 10th commandment, you really have to reread all of the other 9, because now the other 9 can be seen through its lens. All of these things that seem to be just external now have to be refracted through an interior lens. We know that this is exactly what happens in the history of interpretation, because we can see it in Calvin, we can see it in Luther, we can see it in the Roman Catholic Catechism, etc. But we see it already in the Sermon on the Mount, right? When Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say you don't even have lust in your heart. What's Jesus done? He's just read the 10th commandment, and then he's gone back and reread the adultery commandment through its lens. Or you've heard it said, do not commit murder. But I say you don't even be angry with your brother or sister in your heart. What's Jesus saying? Well, he's made it harder, hasn't he? But really what he's just done is read those other commandments through Commandment 10. And Commandment 10 then in and of itself suggests we have a different kind of thing going on in the Decalogue. Not exactly case law. Yes, absolute law, but a curious kind of absolute law. A curious kind of absolute law that's trying to root itself in the interior nature of the person. We're already tending then towards writing a law on the tablets of the heart, aren't we? To use language of Ezekiel or Deuteronomy or Jeremiah and even the New Testament. Okay, so that's the second point. The 10 are comprehensive. The third is that the 10 are amendable. This is really remarkable. The 10 are amendable. So you have the two commandments versions, the two main ones here in 20 and Deuteronomy 5. The differences are underlined, and you can see they're mostly the same in the New Revised Standard Version, and so also in the Hebrew underlying it. But there are some differences. So as important as the 10 are, separated out, first, unmediated, unfolded and repeated, those sorts of things. As important as all that is, they are not above emendation. You can, in fact, amend the Constitution. Fancy that, you know. And so the main differences exist there in the Sabbath commandment. So Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5, observe the Sabbath. That's a slight difference. I mean, what's the big difference? Remember or observe, whatever. But the real difference in this commandment is further down in its motivation clause. So in Exodus 20, rest on the Sabbath because the Lord rested on the seventh day from creation. In Deuteronomy, rest on the seventh day because you were slaves in Egypt. And you know what it's like to never have a break, so don't be Pharaoh to somebody else. That's my paraphrase. But I'm pretty sure it's accurate. something like that. Look at also another important difference in the 10th commandment. In the 10th commandment in Exodus 20, you have a kind of lumping together of lots of things that we in our day in 2022 would not consider to be the same. Namely, a spouse along with a donkey and other such things, right? We don't think those go together. A person is different, especially a spouse is different than somebody else's property, a donkey or an ox. Deuteronomy 5 seems to sort of recognize that because it puts the wife first before the house and uses a separate verb for that and then uses a different verb for all the other things. So Deuteronomy reflects some differences. The question in biblical scholarship is, which is the earliest form of this? Or do they both go back to a still earlier, pre-existent form? Were the 10 Commandments at one time all really pithy statements like we have with murder, adultery, stealing, that's a negation plus a verb? Don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal. Were all of them like that at one point and they've been subsequently expanded? You know, we don't know. But that keeps people like me in business. We have to have something to do with our time. We need to show deans that we're working, and so they have reasons to pay us. In any event, the 10 are amendable. It's a very important thing to think about. Even the 10 can be changed. Don't mess with the 10 unless it's time to mess with them. You know. So to use a memorable phrase from Walter Brueggemann, one of my Old Testament heroes, the 10 Commandments are non-negotiable. But they are always being negotiated, you know, and on many levels, most of which is at the ethical level. But not just there. They're also being negotiated in terms of how they're unfolded. So this goes back to how many decalogues are there. Well, we have number 1 and number 2 in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, but we have a couple other ones too. Preeminently, Decalogue 3. Is another version of, not this Decalogue, but another list of 10 Commandments, according to most people, that occurs in Exodus 34. This is after the golden calf debacle and after the restoration of the relationship between God and Israel. God gives a new set of commandments, and there's a new set of stone tablets, but there's a listing of commandments there that can be numerated as 10. And they're different from these, and they have, in some ways, a more liturgical or ritual focus. And that seems to make good sense in context, where the failure has precisely been at the level of worship and devotion and ritual, insofar as the worship was misdirected to the calf. So that's a third Decalogue, but we'll call that the kind of maverick Decalogue, because it's not exactly like 1 and 2. But number 4 is really like 1 and 2, and that's the Book of Deuteronomy itself. In its central legal section, 12 through 26, lots of scholars, I think they're right, have seen an explication of the 10 Commandments in order with extensive case law. So what does it mean to say you shall not murder? Can you prosecute war? Well, Deuteronomy will be happy to tell you about that. In order. So you get to eventually to the killing commandment, and there's laws about warfare. And there's laws about certain humane treatment of animals. And there's laws about capital punishment. So it seems to be that the central law code of Deuteronomy is an explication of the 10 in order. And it shows that this larger point, that the 10 are amendable or at least in need of explication. This brings me to another quote from Luther that I'll read. Since I've already transgressed once, I'll do it again. And I know Philip already talked about Deuteronomy. This is from his lectures on Deuteronomy. If you want to give the book of Deuteronomy a name suitable for its use, you will correctly call it a most ample and excellent explanation of the Decalogue. After you know it, you could want nothing more that is needful for understanding the 10 Commandments, for it teaches this people to live well according to the 10 Commandments in both spirit and body. So, if you put both of those Luther texts together, you have basically this. You need to know the 10 Commandments, but the best way to learn them is Deuteronomy. So if you're going to go off to a desert island anytime soon, just pack Deuteronomy. That's all you need. Everything else will fall into place, and you'll be qualified to sit in judgment on everything in the world. No one will know because you're on a desert island, but it will be impressive nevertheless. Okay, so one of the things that these commandments, these different versions and the unfolding of it show is the liveliness of the 10 Commandments. And also the liveliness as being related to somehow, for lack of a better term, their vagueness or their open-endedness. So this brings me to my fourth thing, which is my last, and then we can have a conversation about any of these things or other things. And so the last one is a little bit odd, but maybe not in light of what I said so far, and that is that I'm going to say the fourth thing to know about the 10 Commandments is that they are poetic. It doesn't seem like law is closely related to poetry, does it? In fact, it's hardly imaginable that poetry seems, law seems so prosaic. But what I'm getting at here is that the brevity and spareness of the commandments is quite like what one finds in poetic discourse. Poetry is literature with all sorts of intentional gaps in it, all kinds of open space on the page, right? The jagged right-hand margin, all the empty space on the page, just a few words. And that means there's a lot of air blowing through that, breezes kind of going through that poetry, evoking and generating and inviting and requiring interpretation. Parts of the Decalogue are definitely more prosaic than other parts. The extensions, especially the extended explications of the idol and the Sabbath commandments, indicate a kind of desire to be clear about these things, to add further motivation clauses. But as I've said already a number of times, the brevity of commandments 6 through 9 is so brief that it requires and invites additional negotiation. Non-negotiable, but requires more negotiation, including even just the translation of number 6. You shall not murder, according to the NRSV. According to the Common English Bible, which I was on the editorial board for, it's you shall not kill. Well, which one is it? Because kill's a big thing. Like, can't kill a cockroach? I mean, who doesn't want to kill a cockroach? I don't because it's gross, but I don't want them around. Surely cockroach is a sign of sin, in my considered opinion. Both of those translations have little footnotes. So in the NRSV, you shall not murder has a footnote. And you read the footnote, it says, or kill. Okay? This Common English Bible says, you shall not kill, has a footnote, or murder. Right? So they're just flip-flopping. I think it's Umberto Eco, the Italian novelist and cultural critic, etc., said, in translations, footnotes are a sign of weakness. You pick one and you go for it. But in Bible translations, it's a sign that the committee and the translators can't really decide. They lean one way, they have to put something in the body, but they're so close they can't be sure, and they just want to make sure they put that other option in the footnote. I think, I was involved in the CD, I think you shall not kill is the better translation. That is also a much harder thing, because how big do you draw that? Is that only for humans? That must be what they mean. That's not what it says. It doesn't say explicitly, you shall not kill other humans, does it? It could have said that, but it doesn't. And it doesn't because it's brief. It's a little bit vague. It's evocative, it's generative, it's a bit poetic in that regard. Explication is needed. That shows the liveliness of the commandments, and the liveliness of the commandments is in fact generated, I think, by their poetic form. Much is left out of this 10 Commandments, and that is what brings us back to that question of what are they? What kind of law is this? And at least one answer we could say is a poetic kind. And so the last thing I'll say about this is that what I think this means for me, particularly on the murder commandment, which I've had occasion to talk about at various times, including in debates over capital punishment in Georgia, is that the 10 Commandments are sort of always out there ahead of us, beyond us. You know? They're always sort of elusive. Sometimes I think translators want to say, you shall not murder, because they think that's easily done. That is to say, avoided. Of course, Jesus rereads it with the 10th commandment in mind, and it's not so easy after all. It's much harder if you say, you shall not kill. It's a harder commandment to keep, even just as a citizen of a democracy where that sort of stuff is practiced. At the legal level or at the military level or whatever. You shall not kill. So, there's a tendency, I think, for translators and good Christians everywhere to say, it can't mean that, because if it did, I'd be guilty of that. So I want it to be, you shall not murder, which I'm pretty sure most of us can get by without doing. But the point is if it's you shall not kill, that doesn't mean, the commandment could still mean that you shall not kill. It just means that we break it. And would it really be that different than any of these other commandments? All of these commandments are broken with abandon. Not in the general culture, which of course they are, but within the walls of the church. And the 10 Commandments are, it should be pointed out, are not first and foremost directed to the rest of the world. They happen within this covenantal framework to the people of God, for the people of God's life. Is it a cause for alarm that the 10 Commandments aren't kept in the general world? Sort of, but the bigger alarm is when the 10 Commandments aren't kept within the walls of the church. And the biggest problem I have is in the morning when I look at that guy in the mirror and I realize how many commandments he broke, particularly the first commandment. Everything hangs on the first commandment, according to Luther. You get that right, everything else falls into place. So the 10 Commandments are lively, they're out there, they're ahead of us. Even if we don't hit them or achieve them or fulfill them, they are still there, lingering, inviting us to try and maybe do it better next time. And even after we fail, they linger. And even after we are forgiven our transgressions, they still await our fulfillment. So those are my 4. The 10 are important, the 10 are comprehensive, the 10 are amendable, and the 10 are poetic. That's all I can remember, 4 things. So I'm done and happy to have a little conversation or questions about that. Please.
So in this distinction between murder and kill, it seems that murder gives the text sort of internal consistency, right? That it sort of carves out effectively state-sanctioned killing, right? So all the God commanding to bash babies' brains against the rocks and God commanding capital punishment
Right.
all actually kind of works, right? In a way that if God says don't kill and God says go kill,
Right. Right.
you know, you can't reconcile these things.
Right. The consistency.
Or rather, how do you
Yeah. So a couple things. I mean, one thing is just a minor clarification about Psalm 137, which you alluded to with the babies bashing. I think it's important with that psalm just because it's one of my favorites. It is one of my favorites. I've written on it a couple times. I'm still trying to figure it out. I have something coming out in fall that's probably my fourth or fifth take on it, so I still don't have it right. But it's important that a text like that actually doesn't have God doing it, or even commend God doing it, or even commend other people, that God would commend other people to do it. And so it's important that like these details about what Philip called the kind of the violent God or whatever, these stereotypes, the only way to correct some of those is like in the nitty-gritty details, and especially with law, that's kind of important, right? So, but your general point is exactly right. So that is to say, you know, how does God get away with certain things if the commandments prescribe them? And I think in one sense, the ancient Near Eastern people would say the gods do whatever they want to do. And sometimes the more inhuman they are, the more it shows their divinity, their transcendent nature. So the gods are inscrutable. The gods are just raw power, and that raw power often manifests itself in violence against humans, especially humans who are disobedient. And this is a kind of ubiquitous phenomenon in Egypt, Mesopotamia, etc. And I think it has its traces, therefore, also in the presentation of God in the Old Testament. And so what we would sometimes think as a moral failure in the ancient world would be proof of divinity. I mean, that's an intriguing thing to think about, right? Suggests a different kind of sensibility about the deity. But I think you're right. The consistency issue is the question, particularly with reference to things like the prosecution of war. And that's why Deuteronomy comes along and lays these things out. There's rules of engagement. There's rules about first offer peace. If they don't take it, then, you know. So there you can see in the Deuteronomic material, which some people think is later than some of the earlier stuff. I mean, it's debated, but you can see, if that's true, a kind of development within the legal corpora towards things that we would probably be happier with, you know, as moderns. I still think it's a conundrum because the particular verb that's used here is a verb that can be used in some instances to reflect intentional killing, so what we would call murder one, and then in other times can refer to unintentional homicide, involuntary manslaughter, whatever we want to call it. The interesting thing about Israel's legal material is that whether you meant to kill someone or not, it ultimately doesn't matter. You're still strictly liable for their life. You have to pay for it in some way. And Israel recognizes that if you kill someone, it's probably likely, whether you meant to or not, that their brother is going to be upset enough that they want to kill you, because that's how hot passions go. And so, but there's careful articulation about if it's not premeditated, it doesn't deserve, capital punishment. If it's accidental, instead it's a kind of prison term for a period of time, nondescript period of time. So does that help out a little bit? I'm not really answering your question. I'm just deflecting it. But I think the point is right about trying to reconcile, and that shows the unfolding of the commandments for sure.
Well, thank you for your presentation and your points that you made. I have a Jewish friend that has told me that within a few minutes after receiving the Ten Commandments in Mount Sinai, their people began to argue about them and what they meant. And it's this discourse, the rabbinic discourse, and has resulted in a tradition of oral law, the Talmud, that's extensively delegated to help provide interpretation of the law. So he said that it's interpretation and argument about the law is part of our DNA.
Mm.
This is part of the Jewish tradition.
Mhm.
Talk about how do we interpret these things? They're there, but what do they mean? And how do we interpret them? And what are the circumstances that we interpret them? And he said it's a little bit like U.S. Constitution.
Mhm.
There are these rules, pursuit of happiness, etc. Yeah, so what does that mean? And so we have to have courts and other
Right, right.
But the Jewish tradition is very interpretive about these things.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's already within the pages of Scripture itself. So it's not solely the post-biblical rabbinic phenomenon, though it's definitely there. And that's so in codified, text of rabbinic legal discourse, like the Mishnah and the Talmud, show the liveliness of the commandments. The Mishnah commentary on the Torah, the Talmud commentary on the Mishnah, and that doesn't even get into the other things, Midrash and all the rest. I think to maybe connect the two questions and comments, here's the first one. It may be that the tensiveness within the biblical material about things like unintentional homicide versus intentional homicide, or don't killing and the prosecution of war, or not killing and the deity commanding killing in certain instances, all that might reflect in some way that very same dialogism, the tension between the texts, and that already then within the pages of Scripture we have a kind of rabbinic roundtable of people talking around these things. What does it mean to say, you shall not murder, you shall not kill? So, yeah, excellent.
As you were speaking, I was trying to sort out in my own mind the difference between the Ten Commandments as a law or as a set of propositions and the Bill of Rights.
Mm.
So is it the same type of document? And I was thinking one difference was that in the Bill of Rights, Congress sort of collectively were called upon to do certain things, whereas the Ten Commandments appear to be individual admonitions about
Yeah.
things. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the commandments are definitely in their grammatical formulation are second person singular address, so you singular, as opposed to y'all, right? Or, I'm not from the South, so I know the real thing is that the Ten Commandments are to y'all rather than all y'all. That's the real plural, right, is all y'all. So they are technically just to you, not y'all or all y'all. But they occur, of course, within a literary context that is to all y'all. And so I do think they perform, as it were, on both the individual and societal level. Just like we say the creed, I believe, but we usually say it in worship, at least in unison, with a bunch of other I's. So there's sort of a kind of we believe in addition to the I believe. As far as the first part of the question, there has been discussion about the Ten Commandments and human rights by people like Walter Harrelson, who've tried to compare some of these things, and people have talked about kind of the origins of human dignity and so forth in the legal material. I remember being in a conference one time of law and religion, and there was a lot of emphasis being talked about in terms of human dignity, and the locus of that, these lawyer types were saying is in the image of God idea. And in fact, I think, as an Old Testament professor, the image of God idea is not primarily about human dignity at all, but about something else. So I sort of suggested that, and they said, well, where therefore do we root human dignity in the Bible? And I said, in the law, where you don't cheat your neighbor, where you have just practices, you have good courts, you don't, and fair business practices, where everybody gets a chance, regardless of their economic status, to get justice. That says a lot about the dignity of a human individual. In profound ethical ways, rather than a kind of esoteric, ethereal image of God that we're not fully sure what that even means in its literary context. So I think there are some similarities, and particularly with regard to how the Constitution, though it's much longer than the Decalogue, obviously doesn't cover all the things we're thinking about today. How did the founding fathers had no idea about nanotechnology, So how can there be an infringement of rights with regard to nanotechnology if they didn't even know what it was? So these sorts of things are generative. They become a kind of playing field, and then one finds these areas, these space, room to figure out what they mean, and you have to in the courts and in the legal decisions and arguments and all the rest. So, good question.
YouTube audience to put questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any yet, but if one pops up in the next...
There's millions of people online, though, so how could this be?
Yes. The questions may have been asked here.
That's right. They just haven't.
This has been so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to be with y'all. Thanks for the good questions.